Welcome to another deep dive. We have an incredibly intense, highly requested text on the table today.
Oh, yeah, that's a heavy one.
It really is. But before we take a single step further, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe to the show so you never miss one of these breakdowns.
Yeah, definitely make sure to do that.
So our mission today is to analyze this highly provocative, intensely debated new ebook from 2026. It's titled Armed with Logic, A Young Man's Defense Against Soft Totalitarianism. And it's by Conrad Riker.
Right, and look, if you find this breakdown incisive and fascinating, and trust me, the architecture of this book is wild, you really should go buy the book on Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books.
Absolutely. And definitely go follow the author at Conrad and Riker on Substack.
For sure. Because this text, it does not pull a single punch. It is aggressive, highly structured, and it's basically designed to completely reorient how its reader views the modern world.
Yeah, we need to be very clear about the mission and the target audience here, right?
Exactly. Riker is writing explicitly for the red-pilled manosphere. He's writing for men's rights activists and for young men who feel just completely alienated by modern culture.
Right.
His stated goal is to map out the entire history of Western institutions, from ancient Greece all the way to the Enlightenment, and argue how those institutions have been systematically captured.
Captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so because of the nature of that target audience and the heavily political nature of the text, we have to issue a crucial disclaimer before we get into the weeds.
Very important.
This material touches on left-wing and right-wing ideologies, gender politics, evolutionary biology, cultural Marxism. And we want to state explicitly, we are absolutely not taking sides here.
No, not at all. We are not endorsing these viewpoints, nor are we condemning them.
Our job today is strictly as analytical guides. We're just here to impartially unpack Riker's arguments, break down the logic he's using, and convey the ideas contained in the original source material.
Right, so you, the listener, can fully understand the blueprint of his worldview. We're essentially examining how the walls of this specific ideological fortress are held up.
Okay, let's unpack this. Riker sets the stage by bringing up this foundational image of Western philosophy, which is Plato's cave.
Yeah, a classic starting point.
Right. So I want you to imagine for a second that you are sitting on the floor of a dark, damp cavern. Your wrists are chained to the stone. Behind you, there's a massive blazing fire.
And between that fire and your back, a parade of figures is marching past, casting these enormous, distorted shadows on the wall right in front of your face.
Exactly. And you've been there so long that you think those shadows are reality.
It's a comforting illusion, right? Because the shadows are all, But Riker adapts this classical allegory for the modern era.
He does. He asks the reader, what if those shadows aren't just natural shapes?
Yeah, what if, in our modern world, those shadows are corporate HR diversity seminars, social media algorithms, and, 24/7 news cycles engineered to make you apologize for who you are?
It's a pretty stark image. He argues that stepping out of that cave wouldn't just be a personal awakening. It would be an act of open rebellion.
Right, a declaration of war against the people casting the shadows. And he starts by establishing what he calls the epistemological shield.
Right, which, for anyone not fresh out of a philosophy seminar, epistemology is just the study of how we know what we know. It's the study of truth.
Exactly. And Riker claims that modern society is suffering from soft totalitarianism, and he pins the blame entirely on postmodernism.
He views postmodernism not just as a flawed philosophy, but as a deliberate weapon, doesn't he?
Oh, absolutely. Postmodernism essentially claims that reality is subjective, that there is no absolute objective truth, only lived experiences and power dynamics.
Right.
Riker argues that the political left uses this subjective framing to dissolve the boundaries of reality itself. If everything is subjective, then biology isn't real, mathematics is just a tool of Western imperialism, and truth becomes whatever the most emotionally distressed person in the room dictates. But wait, how does he leap from, postmodernism is annoying to postmodernism is totalitarianism?
Yeah.
Because those are two very different things.
That is exactly where the soft modifier comes in. Riker argues that hard totalitarianism uses physical force, right? Guns, tanks, gulags, prisons to mandate compliance.
Sure.
Soft totalitarianism uses psychological coercion, social ostracization, and economic ruin.
So getting canceled, basically.
Yes, but systematized. If the state or the corporation can force you to publicly agree with a premise, is biologically or empirically false, like forcing you to say a square is a circle just to keep your job, They have broken your psychological sovereignty.
Wow. So they have chained you to the wall of the cave.
Exactly.
So to break those chains, he doesn't just argue modern politics. He goes all the way back to the Middle Ages. He introduces what he calls the biological imperative.
Yeah, and he leans heavily on Thomas Aquinas for this and his Summa Theologica from 1274.
Which feels like a massive pivot, right?
Right.
Like, why bring a medieval theologian into a debate about modern HR departments? Well, because Aquinas provides the ultimate grounding in objective reality through the concept of natural law.
Okay, unpack natural law for us real quick.
So, Aquinas argued that the universe has a rational order, and the essential nature of a thing dictates its proper operation. A bird has wings because its nature is to fly.
Right.
Riker strips the heavy theology out of this and uses it to construct a really rigid biological syllogism.
Let's hear it.
His major premise is that natural law dictates that an organism's essential nature determines its purpose.
Yep.
His minor premise is that the essential biological and psychological nature of the human male, driven by millions of years of evolutionary pressure and testosterone, is to systemize, protect, and build.
Which leads to his conclusion that male leadership, what society derisively calls the patriarchy, isn't some oppressive social construct invented in a smoky back room to keep women down.
Exactly. He argues it is an existential biological imperative woven into the fabric of reality, and he coins this term for it, the apex trajectory.
The apex trajectory, what exactly does he mean by that?
It's Riker's label for the biological drive in men to dominate their environment and impose rational order onto chaos. He tells the reader to look at the great leaps in human history.
Like what?
While Isaac Newton didn't decode the laws of gravity through communal consensus, Thomas Edison didn't harness electricity by prioritizing vulnerability.
Right.
The aggressive, highly systematized genius it took to land the Apollo 11 module on the moon in 1969 was the ultimate victory of this masculine apex trajectory pushing against the limits of physics.
So if we connect this to Riker's view on modern culture, specifically this corporate demand for men to be soft and vulnerable, isn't he arguing that society is basically asking a great white shark to apologize for having teeth?
That's a great way to put it.
He's saying, you engineered a world that requires our aggression to build the infrastructure, and now you want to punish us for having that exact aggression.
Exactly that.
But I have to push back on this a little bit. How does he reconcile this rigid, physical, biological determinism with the complexities of the 21st century?
What do you mean?
Well, we aren't all fighting off saber-toothed tigers anymore. Most men work in non-physical labor, just staring at screens all day.
Sure, and Riker anticipates that exact critique. He addresses it by translating physical dominance into psychological and systemic dominance.
Okay.
He argues that the drive to conquer doesn't disappear just because the battlefield moved from a muddy trench to a corporate boardroom or a server farm.
So the instinct is the same, just a different outlet.
Right. The systematizing brain that engineered Roman aqueducts is the exact same brain required to write complex software code, manage global supply chains, or structure financial algorithms.
So he's saying the modern corporate environment has been hijacked to punish the exact executive drive that makes the corporation functional and profitable in the first place.
Precisely. And he actually gives a very specific tactical example of how to handle this in a corporate setting. It's one of the most vivid scenes in the book.
Oh, the paradox of tolerance maneuver.
Yes. Designed specifically for mandatory corporate diversity and inclusion seminars. It illustrates his entire philosophy of using classical logic to dismantle emotional framing.
Walk us through the scenario.
Okay, so he sets it up. A man is trapped in a mandatory unconscious bias training seminar. The HR facilitator demands that everyone in the room acknowledge their inherent invisible biases.
Essentially demanding a public confession of privilege.
Exactly. And the natural instinct for someone in Riker's audience would probably be to get defensive, argue, or just storm out of the room.
Which would probably get them fired. But Riker explicitly says do not do that, right?
Right. He advises cold, hard empiricism. He tells the man to calmly raise his hand and ask the facilitator for the empirical predictive validity of the implicit association. Test the IAT.
The IAT. For context, that's often the foundational tool used in these seminars to prove people have hidden biases, right?
Yeah, by measuring millisecond reaction times to flashing images on a screen.
But why that specific question? What does asking for the predictive validity actually expose?
Because the IAT has faced massive, sustained scrutiny within the mainstream scientific community, many peer-reviewed psychological studies have demonstrated that the test has notoriously low predictive validity when it comes to predicting actual real-world discriminatory behavior.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so by calmly asking the facilitator to provide the scientific empirical data proving the test actually works, Riker argues the man exposes the entire seminar for what it is.
Which is not an educational training based on science, but what he calls an ideological struggle session.
Exactly. And the facilitator likely won't have that data on hand, which breaks the illusion. The man refuses to validate the shadow on the wall.
He forces the conversation out of the subjective realm of my feelings and into the objective realm of data.
Right.
So if biology is the engine of Riker's worldview, history is definitely the chassis. He spends a massive chunk of the book analyzing the foundations of Western civilization.
He does. He claims it was built on a very specific trinity.
What are the three pillars?
He argues that the West achieved its unparalleled stability because it relied on God, representing the ultimate absolute authority and moral lawgiver.
Okay.
The patriarch, who was the unquestioned familial authority and the earthly representation of that divine order, and the state, which was merely the enforcing mechanism for the laws, never the source of moral meaning itself.
And he traces this through two major historical anchors, Roman pragmatism and the Judeo-Christian tradition. Now, Rome and early Christianity famously did not get along, so how does he fuse them together into a unified theory?
Well, what's fascinating here is how he isolates what he views as the foundational strengths of both.
Okay.
He deeply admires the Roman Republic for its cold, unyielding adherence to law, duty, and masculine stoicism. He points to the concept of the Roman paterfamilias.
The male head of the household.
Right, who held absolute legal power, even the power of life and death, over his family. Riker views that centralization of authority as the necessary bedrock of a functioning, disciplined state.
But he acknowledges Rome's flaw, right? That paganism viewed time as a circle.
Yes. Endlessly repeating cycles of rise and fall, power and decay with no ultimate meaning.
Which is where the Judeo-Christian framework comes in, heavily featuring thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas again.
Yeah, because the Judeo-Christian tradition introduced linear time. It introduced the concept of teleological purpose, the idea that history has a trajectory and is moving toward an ultimate rational good.
And it provided an objective moral scaffolding.
Specifically the Ten Commandments, which Riker calls the load-bearing walls of Western common law. It demanded ethical legalism and personal accountability.
And he argues that this demand for objective moral accountability is exactly why modern progressive movements have spent a century trying to destroy it.
Exactly. He actually maps out a timeline of this decay, blaming secularism for creating what he terms a universal dignity deficit.
He doesn't just speak in philosophical abstracts, though. He points to two specific Supreme Court decisions in the United States as the catalyst for this collapse, doesn't he?
He does. First, the 1962 Engel v. Vitale decision, which ruled that state-sponsored prayer in public schools was unconstitutional. And second, the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision.
The mechanism of how this decay happens is critical to Riker's argument. How does he explain it?
According to him, when the state systematically removed God from the public sphere in 1962, it didn't create a utopia of enlightened neutral reason. It created a massive sucking power vacuum.
And nature abhors a vacuum.
Right. By abandoning a higher ethical legalism, he argues the state essentially declared that it was the highest power in the universe.
And then, with cases like Roe v. Wade.
He argues the state declared that human life itself has no inherent sacred value outside of what the state permits.
So absolute morality gets replaced by secular relativism, which he calls the worship of man. And he is very clear that man makes a terrible, tyrannical God.
Because if man is the highest authority, then morality just becomes a raw numbers game of whoever can seize state power and dictate the rules.
To illustrate how a rational man must react to this ideological decay, Riker brings up one of his favorite historical role models, right?
Yeah, the Roman statesman Cato the Elder.
Cato the Elder is a fascinating poll. Cato had this legendary catchphrase. It didn't matter what the Roman Senate was debating. They could be talking about grain taxes, building new roads, whatever. Cato would stand up, give his speech, and end every single one with the exact same phrase.
Carthago delenda est.
Carthage must be destroyed.
Right, because Carthage was Rome's great rival across the Mediterranean. And Cato understood something fundamental about power dynamics. Carthage wasn't a rival you could negotiate with.
They weren't just a trading partner you could occasionally skirmish with and then sign a treaty.
Exactly. They were an existential threat. One of them was going to survive, and the other was going to be wiped off the map.
So Riker uses Cato as a psychological template for the modern man dealing with soft totalitarianism.
Yeah, he argues that modern social justice frameworks, DEI initiatives, and radical feminist ideology are the new Carthage.
They are an internal cancer eating away at the Republic.
And like Cato, Riker tells his readers that you cannot negotiate with this ideology. It requires uncompromising obliteration. You don't try to find middle ground with a parasite, you remove it.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. This leads to one of the most aggressive and controversial claims in the entire book.
Oh, yes.
Riker claims that when secularism murdered the concept of God and abandoned the moral framework, the state didn't just stay in its lane as an administrative body.
Yeah.
He claims the state expanded and essentially cuckolded the human male.
Yeah, he uses that exact word.
I read that and immediately thought, wow, he is using a very specific, highly loaded term that is guaranteed to trigger a visceral reaction in his audience. How does he draw a straight line from secularism to the modern welfare state and justify using a word like that?
Well, he traces the mechanics of taxation and resource allocation. Riker argues that in the original trinity of Western civilization, the man was the sole provider and protector. His authority within the family was intrinsically tied to his burden of providing for it. But starting heavily in the 1960s, and he points specifically to Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society programs in 1964, the government massively expanded the welfare state.
Right.
So Riker views the modern state as a surrogate husband.
A surrogate husband that taxes the biological husband to pay for its own existence.
Precisely his argument. He states that the government forcibly extracts resources from productive, high-value men through income taxation, and then redistributes those resources to subsidize female independence and single motherhood.
So in Riker's view, the state is literally buying female votes with male tax dollars.
Yeah, it severs the dependency, it removes the woman's reliance on the patriarch, and transfers her loyalty to the government bureaucracy.
He calls it a dynamic where the state acts as the ultimate simp.
Right, an artificial entity that lacks intrinsic masculine value, cannot build or protect anything on its own, but buys affection with stolen resources.
He claims this dismantles male authority at the root level, turning the biological father into an ATM for a state that actively despises him.
It's a very intense framing.
It really is.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've mapped the biological imperative, and we've walked through his view of historical decay. Now we arrive at the core antagonist of the book.
Yes.
Riker spends chapters unmasking cultural Marxism and what he calls the emasculation apparatus. To do this, he traces the origin of the modern culture war all the way back to a very specific group in 1923, right?
The Frankfurt School in Germany. And this is a staple subject in many traditionalist and red-pilled circles, but Riker explains the actual theoretical mechanics of what they did.
Walk us through that.
So in the 1920s, Marxist theorists like Antonio Gramsci, Georg Lukács, and Theodor Adorno realized they had a massive problem. The classic Marxist revolution, the workers rising up violently to seize the means of production like they did in Russia, wasn't happening in the West.
Right, because the working class in the West was actually doing pretty well. The capitalist system, despite its flaws, was producing an emerging middle class. Men had houses, cars, and families. They were comfortable.
And Riker points out that these theorists realized a fundamental truth. The Western working man wouldn't revolt because he was deeply embedded in the patriarchal capitalist family structure.
He loved his wife. He wanted to provide for his kids. He liked his quiet life.
Exactly. The family unit was a bulwark against state revolution. So, according to Riker, the Frankfurt School realized they had to change tactics completely.
Okay, so what was the pivot?
Instead of attacking capitalism directly through economics, they had to strategically target and destroy the nuclear family itself.
But how do you do that? I mean, you can't just outlaw the family.
You do it through critical theory. They injected academic frameworks designed to relentlessly criticize and pathologize male authority. They aimed to break down the cultural bonds, the respect for tradition, and the moral frameworks that kept the society stable.
So by convincing women they were oppressed by their husbands and convincing children they were oppressed by their parents, they could shatter the family from the inside out.
Yes. This shift from economic warfare to cultural warfare is what Riker refers to as cultural Marxism.
And he claims this ideological subversion metastasized into our institutions over decades, specifically taking root in the education system, creating this massive emasculation apparatus.
He points to a very specific piece of legislation for this, the 1972 Title IX Act.
Now, most people think of Title IX as the law that ensures women get equal funding for college sports. That's the mainstream narrative. But Riker sees it as a Trojan horse, doesn't he?
He does. He argues that while Title IX was sold to the public as a rational extension of civil rights, its bureaucratic implementation was systematically hijacked by radical feminist theorists within academia.
So instead of just ensuring equal access to a swimming pool or a track team,
he claims that Title IX bureaucracy became a sprawling administrative state used to fundamentally pathologize normal boyhood. It shifted from equal funding to enforcing female-coded emotional compliance across all academic behavior.
wow. And he goes back even further to show how the medicalization of male energy started long before the 1970s.
Yeah, he points to 1902 to a series of lectures by a British physician named George Still.
Right. Still was lecturing on what he called defects of moral control in children.
And Riker says this was the exact moment the medical establishment began shifting the blame.
Instead of admitting that a rigid, sit still at a desk for 8 hours educational system is biologically flawed for young boys.
The establishment decided the boys themselves were flawed. It's a profound accusation regarding how we treat childhood.
So Roker is arguing that the massive modern spike in prescribing amphetamines like Adderall to young boys isn't some great medical breakthrough in treating a disease.
No, he calls it a chemical restraint system. He says the modern educational system demands that boys sit perfectly still and be quiet, which violently conflicts with their biological imperative to move, build, and conquer.
So when the boys inevitably act out because they're bored out of their minds?
The system sedates them rather than adapting the environment to their nature. He says we are drugging boys into oblivion so they fit the mold of a compliant, feminized worker drone because the female-dominated teaching profession cannot handle masculine energy.
And what happens when those compliant, sedated drones grow up and enter the workforce? Riker brings up a very famous modern example to illustrate the trap waiting for them.
Yes, the 2017 Google memo by James Damore. This is a critical case study in Riker's book regarding the modern corporate demand for vulnerability.
For context, in 2017, James Damore, who was a software engineer at Google, wrote an internal memo suggesting that the gender gap in the tech industry might be partially due to biological differences in interests.
Right. The idea that men naturally gravitate toward things, women gravitate toward people, rather than it being purely systemic sexism.
He was fired, and it became a massive global news story. But Riker focuses on the psychological setup that preceded the memo.
Right. This is the part that usually gets left out of the story. Riker points out that before Damore published that memo, he attended these corporate diversity and inclusion workshops where Google management explicitly encouraged employees to be vulnerable.
To share their struggles, to open up. And Damore took the bait.
He did. He confessed to feelings of burnout and imposter syndrome. According to Riker, Damore believed the utopian lie that showing weakness fosters genuine human connection in a corporate environment.
But Riker argues that the moment Damore lowered his stoic shield, the HR apparatus mapped his vulnerabilities.
Exactly. When he later published his memo, they didn't just disagree with his data, they used his previously confessed vulnerabilities as proof that he was psychologically defective, and they purged him.
So Riker uses this as a massive cautionary tale. He tells his audience, the system demands male vulnerability not to help you and not to heal you, but to catalog your weaknesses for future career assassination.
Vulnerability is a trap. It is data collection for your enemies.
Which perfectly transitions into his analysis of the nice guy syndrome. Riker spends a lot of time deconstructing the psychology of the modern agreeable male.
He does. He says society conditions men to suppress their assertiveness, to apologize constantly, and to project this inoffensive, subservient image.
I was reading this section, and I immediately thought of Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. Riker is basically arguing that the nice guy treats himself as a means to an end, right?
That is an incredibly apt philosophical analogy. Kant's categorical imperative states that you must always treat humanity, whether in yourself or in others, as an end in itself, never merely as a means to an end. So Riker is arguing that the nice guy operates on an inauthentic, covert contract with society. He acts subservient and suppresses his true nature to extract a reward, whether that is affection, sex, or professional advancement.
He's groveling, he's acting like a doormat because he thinks there's a prize at the end.
Exactly, and by doing so, he violates his own human dignity. He lacks the rational autonomy required of a free thinker.
But Riker also attacks this from an evolutionary biology perspective, doesn't he?
Yes, he states that women are inherently hypergamous, meaning they are biologically wired to seek mates who display strength, competence, and capable leadership.
Therefore, the nice guy is actively destroying the exact traits that trigger natural attraction.
Making himself existentially repulsive to women while thinking he's doing exactly what society asked of him. It's a total psychological double bind that drives young men insane.
Okay, so we've established the psychological traps. But Riker says those are just the appetizer, because the physical and legal traps are where the real damage is done.
Oh, absolutely. He views the modern legal system not as a bastion of blind justice, but as a completely hostile, weaponized environment for men.
He specifically attacks frameworks like the Duluth Model and the Violence Against Women Act.
Right. Riker applies Aristotelian logic to the legal system to explain how it failed. His premise is that a state legislating based on identity politics rather than blind individual justice is inherently biased.
And he claims the modern state operates exclusively on gynocentric, meaning female-centered identity politics.
Exactly. Therefore, the family courts and domestic legal frameworks are what he calls a prosecutorial meat grinder.
Break down his attack on the Duluth Model for us. How does that actually work in practice?
So the Duluth model is a very common framework used by police and courts in domestic violence intervention. Riker attacks it because he argues it operates on the foundational ideological assumption that men use violence primarily to maintain patriarchal power and control.
While female violence is almost exclusively categorized as reactive self-defense.
Right, so Riker argues this prejudges every domestic dispute. If the police arrive, the ideological framework dictates that the man is the oppressor by default, regardless of the empirical facts of the altercation.
He compares modern Title IX tribunals on college campuses and the whole Believe All Women framework to a very dark chapter in English history, the 1632 Star Chamber. Actually, I had to look this up because it's such a specific historical reference.
Yeah, the Star Chamber was a notoriously arbitrary English court that operated without a jury, without due process, and was used by the monarchy to crush political dissent.
Riker mentions the case of William Prynne, right? A Puritan who had his ears literally cut off by the Star Chamber just for writing a book the Queen found offensive.
And Riker draws a direct, chilling parallel to modern campus tribunals. He claims young men are expelled, have their academic careers ruined, and are branded as predators without access to legal representation.
Without the right to cross-examine their accuser and without the basic presumption of innocence. He says the university system has regressed to a pre-Enlightenment Inquisition.
But he points out that even the highest courts in the land have recognized this legislative overreach. He brings up the year 2000 Supreme Court case, United States v. Morrison.
Right. In United States v. Morrison, the Supreme Court actually struck down a civil remedy provision of the Violence Against Women Act.
The court ruled that Congress had overstepped its constitutional bounds under the Commerce Clause and the 14th Amendment by trying to federalize domestic civil disputes.
And Riker uses this case to validate his core thesis. He says, look, even the Enlightenment-based institutions, when functioning properly, recognize that this legislation is an unconstitutional subversion by the feminist lobby.
Yet, he argues, political and social pressure just normalizes the overreach again and again, completely ignoring the Constitution.
So because the state is hostile, Riker provides defensive tactics. He tells the greeters they have to practice what he calls legal alchemy. Things like prenuptial agreements and asset protection trusts.
Right. Now, in mainstream society, if a guy asks for a prenup, he gets shamed. People say it's unromantic, it means he doesn't trust his partner, or he's planning for divorce before the wedding even happens.
But Riker reframes the prenup entirely. He calls it an Enlightenment treaty with a legally hostile state.
He tells men that marriage is no longer a religious sacrament recognized by the state. It is a sprawling financial liability governed by biased courts.
If you enter a marriage without heavily negotiated legal protections and offshore trusts, you are walking onto a battlefield naked.
Exactly. The trust is your castle wall. You have to put your assets behind impenetrable legal stone before the whore even thinks about breaching the gates.
He also advocates for something I found pretty extreme, but mathematically logical given his worldview. The lawful deployment of hidden audio recordings.
Yes, specifically in jurisdictions that have one-party consent laws for recording conversations.
He advises men to treat every hostile negotiation, every breakup, or every meeting with a duplicitous HR department like a Cold War intelligence operation.
Why? Because he says the progressive left relies on plausible deniability and gaslighting to alter past events. A digital audio file is an undeniable empirical truth.
It obliterates fabricated charges instantly. He's essentially telling men they have to become their own private intelligence agency to survive.
Which is wild to think about.
It really is. So what does this all mean for a man's career? Let's bring this back to the workplace. If the legal system is hostile and the HR department is setting traps, how does a man survive corporate America?
This brings us to what Riker calls the syllogism of the diversity paradox. This is his absolute core argument against DEI diversity, equity, and inclusion mandates. And he frames it purely as a logic puzzle.
Riker loves using syllogisms to expose what he sees as logical contradictions. The syllogism of the diversity paradox goes like this, right? Premise 1. The foundational axiom of modern DEI is that all demographic groups possess absolutely identical distributions of innate capability, intelligence, and interest. Premise 2. We observe unequal outcomes in the real world. For instance, there are more men in executive corporate roles or STEM fields. The DEI conclusion is that this unequal outcome proves the existence of malicious, systemic discrimination, and therefore, artificial quotas must be mandated to engineer equal outcomes.
That is the standard corporate line today. But where is the logical trap?
Well, the trap is in the solution. He argues that by mandating quotas, the corporation is openly admitting that equal outcomes cannot and will not occur naturally without artificial top-down force.
Oh, I see. So if equal outcomes can't occur naturally, then premise 1, that all groups are perfectly identical in capability and interest, is mathematically and biologically false.
Exactly. He calls it a self-licking ice cream cone of ideological contradiction. If the foundational premise is false, the entire systemic justification for DEI collapses on itself. It proves the very biological differences it claims to fight.
Okay, so we've laid bare the systemic threats. The biological imperative, the historical decay, the psychological landmines, and the legal quagmire. How does the listener actually fight back in their daily life?
Right. We transition into the tactics of what Riker calls the Rational Patriarch, the master of the stoic citadel.
Riker's primary psychological defense is a concept he calls becoming the gray rock tyrant.
The gray rock method is a known psychological tactic for dealing with abusive narcissists, right? You become as uninteresting, unemotional, and unresponsive as a gray rock, so the abuser gets bored and leaves you alone.
Yeah, but Riker militarizes this concept. He says the modern man must become an unshakable force of stoic pragmatism who absolutely refuses to validate the emotional terrorism of the left.
Because he argues the left doesn't operate on logic anymore. They operate on emotional manipulation. To explain this, he introduces this concept called the solipsistic funnel.
Solipsism being the philosophical idea that only one's own mind is sure to exist, right? It's the ultimate self-centeredness.
Exactly. The solipsistic funnel is Riker's framework for how what he calls the female-coded hive mind processes information.
He argues that the modern left filters every global event, every economic shift, and every scientific discovery through a single narcissistic metric. How does this make me feel, and how can I leverage this for female advantage?
He claims they strip all objective truth and nuance from an event and mine it purely for grievance and political leverage.
So to combat this, Riker says you can't fight feelings with feelings. You have to go back to the Greeks. You have to master Aristotle's 3 pillars of rhetoric: ethos, pathos, and logos.
Ethos is your credibility, your character, and your posture. Pathos is the emotional appeal. Logos is the logical structural argument.
Right. And Riker argues that the modern left has completely abandoned logos because their postmodern theories cannot survive basic empirical scrutiny.
They rely entirely on a weaponized pathos, emotional outbursts, crying, screaming, and manufactured victimhood to force compliance through social discomfort.
Riker tells his reader that to dominate these interactions, you must wield logos like a broadsword, anchoring every single argument in ruthless empiricism.
He highlights some very specific tactical advice for this, like, what do you do when someone accuses you of a microaggression in a meeting? Riker says, you deploy the so what defense.
It's a tactic of strategic indifference. If someone says, your tone is making me feel unsafe, the natural instinct of the conditioned nice guy is to apologize and backpedal to restore the peace.
But Riker says absolutely not. You look at them and say, so what? You refuse to validate their subjective offense.
Narcissism requires an audience. If you starve it of a reaction and refuse to accept their emotional framing, the psychological hold breaks.
He also warns his readers to watch out for the argumentum ad misericordiam.
Which is the classic logical fallacy of the appeal to pity.
Right. When a debate opponent starts whining about hurt feelings, historical marginalization, or their personal anxiety instead of providing data, Riker says you must verbally flag it in real time.
You don't get mad. You look at them and say, you are attempting to substitute emotional manipulation for empirical evidence. Do you have data, or are we done here?
You expose the tactic to neutralize it. To give a masterclass example of what this looks like in practice, Riker points to the 1971 television debate on firing line between conservative intellectual William F. Buckley Jr. and the liberal writer Gore Vidal.
Oh, yeah. Riker holds this specific debate up as the absolute pinnacle of masculine rhetorical dominance.
Regardless of what you think of Buckley's politics, he was famous for his razor-sharp vocabulary, his unbothered posture, and his ability to dismantle highly emotional arguments with cold, aristocratic logic.
Riker tells his readers to study that footage like game tape. Notice how Buckley never raises his voice, never apologizes for his intellect, and never lets his opponent's hysteria break his frame.
That unbroken frame is the ethos of the Rational Patriarch. Reading this section, it really feels like Riker is telling men to treat the digital public square the way a Cold War spy treats a hostile foreign capital.
That's a great analogy. You assume every room is bugged. You assume everyone is an operative looking to extract information.
He says, leave 0 digital breadcrumbs, encrypt all your sensitive communications, and never ever give the ideological zombies ammunition.
If you don't post your private thoughts on the cloud, the mob can't dig them up a decade later to destroy your career.
It is a doctrine of extreme operational security. He views the internet as a permanent, hostile record controlled by ideological enemies.
His advice is to starve them of information. Be a ghost online, but be an absolute titan in your physical reality.
Which brings us to the climax of the book, Praxis. Forging the future in the fires of degeneracy. Praxis is the actual application of a theory into practice.
Right.
And this is where Riker drops his biggest bombshell, and where he breaks from a lot of his contemporaries. He explicitly tells his readers to stop trying to conserve modern institutions.
This is a major departure from mainstream conservatism, which usually focuses on winning elections, passing bills, and trying to fix the system from within.
But Riker says that is a logical fallacy of the highest order. He argues you cannot conserve an institution that has already been fundamentally subverted and weaponized against you.
He has this incredible analogy to illustrate this. He says, trying to fix the modern corporate or welfare state is like trying to preserve a house that has been completely eaten by termites, by politely asking the termites to respect the original blueprints.
Right. The system isn't broken, according to Riker. It is functioning exactly as its cultural Marxist engineers intended it to function.
So instead of trying to win a rigged game, Riker champions the creation of a completely parallel society. To justify this, he invokes Vilfredo Pareto's 80-20 rule, the Pareto principle.
The idea that 80% of consequences come from 20% of causes. We usually see this in business.
Yeah.
80% of your sales come from 20% of your clients. How does he apply this to a cultural revolution?
He applies it to the male population. He says 80% of modern men have been completely absorbed by the NPC zombie horde.
They are fully pacified by digital distractions, cheap dopamine, pornography, and feminist guilt.
Right. They are gone, unsalvageable. But that leaves a vital, highly capable top 20%. Riker tells this 20% to shoulder the burden of rebuilding civilization.
He wants them to form mastermind groups, pool their capital, create their own supply chains, and completely bypass the ESG and DEI-controlled corporate state.
And he cites a real-world example to prove this isn't just internet fantasy or some compound in the woods. He points to the 2001 libertarian migration.
He's referring to the Free State Project. This was a movement where thousands of libertarians pledged to move to a single state, New Hampshire, to concentrate their voting bloc and capture the local political, legal, and economic ecosystems.
Riker uses this as proof of concept. If you gather enough highly competent, rational, well-resourced men in one geographic or digital location, you can render the hostile federal state irrelevant to your daily life.
You build a wall of competence they cannot breach. But building a parallel society isn't just about economics and voting blocks. For Riker, fatherhood is the final frontier.
He views the family unit as the ultimate sovereign microstate, and he gives very specific instructions on how to raise children in this hostile environment.
He insists on using the family dinner table for what he calls Socratic interrogations.
He recognizes that children will inevitably be exposed to state-sponsored narratives, whether in public schools, through peers, or online.
Instead of just shielding them, which he views as defensive and weak, Riker wants fathers to actively deprogram them.
At the dinner table, he says the patriarch must command attention and force his children to rationally defend the assertions their teachers fed them that day.
So if a kid comes home and repeats a talking point about equity or gender, The father doesn't just say that's wrong, he interrogates them.
Exactly. By exposing the logical holes in the progressive narrative through relentless Socratic questioning, the father builds a fortress of logic in the child's mind.
He teaches them how to think, not just what to think, making them immune to emotional manipulation.
To hammer home the stakes of failing to do this, he warns against the trap of egalitarianism by citing a very strange piece of history, the 19th century Shaker sect.
The Shakers are a fascinating mathematical proof for Riker's argument. They were a religious group that enforced absolute radical equality between the sexes.
They believed gender was secondary to the spirit, and their founder, Mother Ann Lee, was actually seen as a female Christ.
But to maintain this perfect equality and avoid the messy realities of biology and hierarchy, they also mandated strict celibacy for all members.
Which means they didn't have any kids. They relied entirely on converts.
Precisely. Riker points out that by trying to completely erase the biological imperative and the natural hierarchy of the sexes, the Shakers achieved their egalitarian utopia.
And what was the result? Complete mathematical extinction. They bred themselves out of existence.
Riker uses this to argue that egalitarianism is fundamentally an anti-life, anti-civilization philosophy. It leads to a demographic death spiral.
It all comes back to biology for him. Even in his closing chapters, he attacks Cartesian mind-body dualism.
René Descartes famously argued that the mind and the body are separate entities. I think, therefore I am. Riker says that is a cowardly excuse used by weak academics to justify their physical rot.
Riker insists that the mind and body are intrinsically one. A man cannot claim to be a rational patriarch if his physical body is weak, soft, and undisciplined.
He explicitly mandates that men must lift heavy weights, engage in physical combat training, and forge their bodies into an impenetrable stoic vessel.
The physical strength deters real-world violence, while the brutal discipline required to build that strength fortifies the mind against the psychological warfare of the modern state.
You cannot be mentally tough if you are physically weak. It's a total comprehensive lifestyle overhaul.
It really is.
We've covered a massive amount of ground today, tracing this argument from ancient Rome to modern HR departments.
Right, it's a huge scope.
To summarize, Armed with Logic is an intense, highly structured manual. Conrad Riker is attempting to arm his readers with the classical logic of Aristotle, the natural law of Aquinas, and a deep reservoir of historical grievances to forge what he calls a new rational patriarchy.
He wants men to build a stoic citadel in their minds, protect their assets with ironclad legal treaties, and walk away from a society he believes is committing civilizational suicide.
It is a masterclass in applying formal logic and historical precedent to modern cultural grievances. Whether one agrees with his premises or not, the architecture of his argument is undeniably robust.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, it raises a truly profound, almost terrifying question that Riker doesn't fully answer in the text.
Lay it on us. What's the blind spot?
If Riker's vision actually comes to pass, if this top 20% of highly competent, stoic, well-resourced men actually follow his advice, if they completely withdraw their labor, their capital, their tax revenue, and their loyalty from mainstream institutions to build completely separate, parallel society, what happens to the underlying social contract of the nation state?
Wow.
Does society simply bifurcate into two entirely alien civilizations occupying the exact same geographic space? One governed by hyper-egalitarian, state-subsidized emotionalism, and the other by ruthless, patriarchal meritocracy.
And historically, has a fracture like that ever ended without a seismic, devastating cultural collision?
Exactly.
That is a heavy thought to sit with. A society physically sharing a country, but living in completely different realities, heading straight toward a collision.
It's definitely something to think about.
If this breakdown sparked your curiosity, if you want to trace the logic, read the syllogisms, and explore the source material for yourself, you need to go check out Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks to buy Armed with Logic.
And be sure to follow Conrad Riker on his Substack at Conrad and Riker.
It is a text that demands to be reckoned with, if only to understand the shifting tectonic plates of our current cultural moment.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us in the deep end today. Remember to like this video, subscribe to the show for more deep dogs, and hit the notification bell.
And the next time you find yourself staring at a screen, feeling that unearned guilt creep in,
just remember to ask yourself who is tending the fire and who is casting the shadows on your wall. See you next time.